I saw hell in the hospital hallway. Posted by Darkheroxx. Sorry in advance for the long post. I'll be calling myself Sarah, and I work at a hospital in upstate New York as a nurse. I was originally from Pennsylvania, but just recently moved towards the Big Apple for a change of pace and scenery. I love doing my job because I genuinely love helping people, but some things have started happening here recently that made me rethink my plans of staying here. There are tons of stories at the hospital I work at. There's one story of a man who was admitted one evening because he collapsed at his construction job. When a doctor came to examine him, he told the man that he would have to stay a while to run some tests. Well, time passed, and he had gotten much worse. He could barely breathe and he was in immense pain. When the results finally came back, they told the man that he had asbestos, a condition that scars the lungs from breathing in asbestos fibers from his work. Unfortunately, that was not uncommon back then. Well, the man didn't take the news very well. He was in pain and didn't want to allow the disease to eat away at him any longer. It was later that night when he walked towards his door and looked to see if the hallways were empty. There was an eerie silence around him and no other signs of life in his vicinity. The man proceeded to get on his knees and place his neck on the door frame. Using all of his strength, the man proceeded to slam the wooden door onto his neck over and over and over. Slam, 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 crack. It was an instant, but the man was in a crazed stupor as he continuously slammed the door onto his neck. Blood splattered everywhere, and as the sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking filled the hallway, his labored breaths began to gurgle as his throat began to fill with crimson. A short time later, some nurses had found his mess of a body and their screams carried into the night. Apparently, that floor isn't used anymore and you can still hear the doors slam. I've been there, done that. I get it. It's fun to scare the newbies when they arrive, especially the ones on night shift. I'm sure this place has some history, but I doubted the existence of the supernatural wandering the hospital. At first, when they told me about the ghosts, I chuckled and brushed it off. But when my CNO, Chief Nursing Officer, insisted for me to be careful my first night, I thought I'd pretend to take it a bit more seriously. I ended up going weeks without experiencing a single thing aside from the normal crazy of just working in a hospital, especially during COVID. With the massive influx of patients following the pandemic, we had to clean up and open up every room that we had, even the previously mentioned unused floor. It was one night I was going through the halls and I had to investigate a noise. I came into Jack's room one night and he asked me if I could give him anything to help him sleep. When he first came in a few days ago, he was extremely bright and chipper despite his condition, but tonight he was pale and shaking. That concerned me and I asked him if his chest pains were keeping him up at night, and he looked at me with small tears forming in the corner of his eyes. He shuddered as he told me that someone keeps coming into his room at night. This was my first time hearing about anything like this, so I asked if he could tell me more. Jack downcast his eyes as he began to rub his shaking hands together. He told me that late at night, he would hear his door open and slam shut. He would wake up to see a dark figure crawling towards him. Now I asked if it was another nurse that we had, but Jack was sure it wasn't them. Jack described the figure as a large man with short white hair. His mouth was open and he said blood was slowly trickling out of it. He began to shiver a bit as he continued to describe what he saw. Jack continued by telling me that the man was in an old hospital gown, but it was worn with splatters of blood on it. He began to close his eyes as he told me the man's neck was crooked and broken. The flesh on the neck was torn open to reveal shattered bone. I felt sorry for the man. I assumed he had more issues than just chest pains, so I assured him that we would get someone to check off something that would help him. I had to make my rounds to check on other patients, but I told him I would check on him again soon. As I closed the door to his room, I could hear him quickly shuffle back onto his bed. I made my way around the hall towards the other patients. They all complained about losing sleep, not from a man visiting them at night, but the sound of a door slamming in the hallway. I talked to some of the other nurses about it, and their faces were in absolute shock. They didn't want to listen to any more and told me I shouldn't be trying to scare them. I didn't know what else to do, but maybe it was just a coincidence. After forcing down a can of Red Bull and a cup of coffee, I looked at my watch. It was around 3 a.m., so I wanted to go and check on the patients. I walked towards the elevator and pressed the button to go up towards the old floor. I forced a laugh as I remembered Jack's account of the man he saw, one of the old stories about a man who killed himself, and a few other tales that other nurses told me. I didn't want to scare myself, but the description of the figure and the fear I saw in Jack's eyes, that very fear began to slowly sink into me. The elevator doors slowly creaked open and I was met with a dimly lit hallway. We had to save on power, so late at night we wouldn't have all the lights on. As I walked through towards the hall, the lights began to flicker. The fluorescent lamps began to buzz as my footsteps slowly echoed through the hallway. I saw something at the end of the hallway from one of the rooms, Jack's room. Something was peering at me from the bottom of the doorway. Only the top of their head was visible, but I was able to make out a thin tuft of white hair atop the man's head. As the lights flicked, the flashes of light hit their face and I could see their eyes glow white. I could hear my breath begin to shudder as I started towards the head, and I could hear another breath. It sounded as if someone was taking short breaths while submerged in water. The quick inhales were low, and I could hear something snap with each labored breath. I jumped as a sudden slam erupted from their direction, and suddenly another, and another. The sound of a door slamming began to echo throughout the hallway, and each time it slammed, I could hear something squish, something snap, something tear. I wanted to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Was I having some kind of waking nightmare? A hallucination? Has my mind conjured some sort of phantom from all those damn stories? Before I was able to let out my own, a yell could be heard down the hall from Jack's room. His cry of terror made my blood run cold as ice. Then another scream, and another scream, all coming from other patients' rooms. The sound came rushing towards me, a dark symphony of horrified cries resonating into my skull. My legs shook and I fell to my knees, desperately trying to mute the sound by covering my ears. My head was ringing and I felt blood running down my nostrils. Tears began to flood my eyes, and when I screamed, I couldn't hear anything at all. I was completely drowned in screams. I looked forward and I saw the head slowly move out of the doorway. When it fully emerged from Jack's room, I could see it was indeed in an old hospital gown. It was on the floor, propping itself up on its legs and arms. Each limb was bending in an inhuman way, like the legs of a spider, the way the joints shot up and bent downwards. The figure's head was bent, broken, and it swayed back and forth as its eyes flashed white from the flickering of the lights. Each time its neck sways, it splatters dark red blood onto the walls. It was looking towards me with its mouth slack-jawed. Despite being surrounded by screams, I could faintly hear its blood-soaked inhales. It just stared at me, and I began to slowly shuffle backwards towards the elevator doors. That's when it began to step towards me, and each time it got closer, the dimming lights behind it would pop and shatter. It crept towards me slowly, while the darkness followed behind it. I was sure I was in hell at this point as the screams got louder, the figure creeping closer, and the darkness covering the hallway. It was only a few feet away from me now. Its limbs groaned and cracked as it moved closer and closer. I'll never forget how its eyes stayed fixed upon me as its broken neck swayed back and forth as its jaw hanging down to reveal a small flow of blood. My back was completely on the elevator door and it was so close to me. It began to scramble over me. Its bent spider-like arms were on either side of me and it pushed its face closer to mine. All I could see was its rotten pale face, and behind it, a dark abyss. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The screams must have deafened me. But I pushed my head onto the elevator door and closed my eyes tightly. As it got even closer, I could feel a cold breath brush my cheeks. I suddenly fell backwards and my head fell onto the floor of the elevator. I looked up to see another nurse, May, looking down at me confused. She saw that I was white as a sheet and quickly got down to examine me. Blood was trickling out of my nose and ears, and tears were gushing out of my eyes. I could barely speak. All that came out were cries. I looked towards the hallway, and it was dimly lit with all of the doors closed. May rushed me out of there and had a doctor go out of his way to look at me. I had to take a week off of work. I was a complete mess, and when I finally recovered, I vowed not to speak of it again. Out of sight, out of mind. I never saw that figure again. There's whispers, of course, from the staff saying I saw a ghost. I'm just too afraid to admit what I saw. What scares me the most is that this is just one story. There are many, many more that are echoing through this hospital, and I'm terrified to see the worst of them. Thank you for taking this trip with me tonight. If you like my content, please remember to hit the like and subscribe. And until next time, good night.